Welcome to the Worth Listening podcast, where we focus on having positive and productive conversations around money. I'm your host, Lauren, a 4-time Olympian and certified financial planner. On this show, my guests share their money stories. Everyone has a unique story and experiences both wins and losses when it comes to money. My intent is to give listeners something they can relate to, something that builds their courage to be open and take control of their own money story. When I'm not creating a great show for my listeners, I'm running my company, Worth Winning, where I help individuals and families organize their finances. Check us out at worth-winning.com. All right, now on with the show. Happy New Year, everyone. I know you missed me, but I am back. We took a break so that I could brainstorm how to keep bringing you all meaningful content about money. This show is about creating space for everyone to feel more comfortable discussing various money topics. That being said, I decided to tackle a semi-controversial issue for season 1 of 2020, the racial wealth divide. So if you've never heard of the term before, the wealth gap measures the difference between the median wealth of Blacks versus the median wealth of whites. So you may not have heard of it before, but we're going to deep dive into this topic over the next 4 episodes. And I'm bringing you conversations through 4 different lenses. I will be speaking to artists, educators, a consumer, and you will hear the point of view of a member of the majority community. If you don't know what I'm saying, a white guy. I thought it was really important to create the opportunity for various voices to be heard so that you have the best opportunity to shape your opinions on more than just one perspective. So to get this party started, I chose a dynamic duo to educate us more about the history of the racial wealth divide. Pam Capalad is a certified financial planner who founded Brunch and Budget to help people who felt ashamed or embarrassed about money have a safe and friendly place to talk about it and to make real financial progress. I'm sure you can see why I love her already. Dyalekt is an MC, a hip-hop educator, actor, and a playwright. His work focuses on celebrating identity and finding your voice, communicating with others authentically, and building up community. His most recent work, The Museum of Dead Words, is a hip-hop theater show on communication and empathy in the age of the internet. Together, they co-founded Pockets Change and facilitate hip-hop and finance workshops for kids, teens, and college students across the country. Pam and Dyalekt also host the Brunch and Budget podcast, focused on personal finance as an act of social justice, and they founded the Race and Wealth Podcast Network. They are regular keynotes on how art, culture, and media are used to perpetuate racial wealth inequality. These two are my very good friends and have taught me so much about race and wealth. And I love it that they come with the facts, even though they may be hard to hear. They are incredibly knowledgeable about the historical policies around the racial wealth divide that have been effective and the ones that have hurt instead of helped. They've got a lot of information for all people of all colors to hear so that we can work together to close this gap. This season is going to be unreal. Make sure that you listen to all 4 episodes. Without further ado, let's listen to Pam and Dyalekt share more with us on the racial wealth divide. As if I didn't just say enough about you all, Pam and Dyalekt, I cannot tell you how excited I am to have you on this show. I'm kind of a fangirl. You guys don't know this about me, but we're friends, but I'm also very much a fan of your work. And so I'm super excited to have you all on as experts on the topic, the racial wealth divide today.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, we're fans of you too, so we can just fangirl each other.
Yeah. I'm fans of all my friends. That's why we're friends.
Fans of being fans of each other. Yes. All right. So I'd like to start by just talking about what is the racial wealth divide?
First of all, it's an offshoot of overall wealth inequality.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good place to start. We should start there because I feel like wealth inequality in general is something that's been happening, I'd say probably since the 70s, and with deregulation in the 80s is really when it accelerated, if you want to know the history of that.
Well, and by the way, if anyone wants to get pedantic about it, yes, wealth inequality started from the beginning
of time.
Well, currency.
Yeah.
One of these things that I call it like the one jerk rule, where these systems, capitalism, communism, socialism, they would work really well if everybody was cool. But all it takes is one jerk to mess it up. And that happened from jump.
That happened.
But what Pam is talking about is a very specific set of circumstances that has led this economy to where it is currently.
Yes, exactly. Particularly in the United States, because if we think back or look back to the 50s, for instance, and we look back to the original concept of the American dream, which really was, hey, everyone can own a home with a white picket fence, 2.5 kids, take a family vacation once in a while, earn a living wage, right? Everyone has a right to work, all of that kind of stuff. What ended up happening was in the 70s and 80s with things like deregulation, all of a sudden CEOs who were maybe making 10, 12 times more than the average worker started making 100 to 300 times more than the average worker. And that's really where wealth inequality, I'd say, transitioned from. There are going to be people who have more money than others, but the idea of billionaires existing or people having so much more money than another person really, I think, started with the 70s and 80s and that shift.
Well, and what's funny is the wrong word, but what is interesting about that is a direct policy and, I guess, free market reaction to the civil rights era.
Yes, well, and to go back to this time in the 50s that I just described so idyllically was that is what white America had access to. So
they could pay off their college with a summer job.
Yeah. The racial wealth divide starts with slavery, let's be real, right? Starts with slavery. It starts with basically policies and culture in place that allow us to marginalize certain races.
It basically started as, well, we needed a law to make slavery make sense. And then slavery built our economy. And then when that was questioned and asked to be changed, well, what do you do with the backbone of your economy? You find other ways to do it. So that's when, when we talk about Jim Crow and we talk about even up to
redlining.
Yeah.
When we talk about the GI Bill and who was left out of the GI Bill, there are a lot of moments in history and a lot of policies in history that have led to generational poverty, particularly with Black people and Latinx people.
Yeah, and that's kind of the fulcrum from which this operates. We would get into more detail about any one of those issues, but that would be an entire podcast in of itself.
Yes, and the stat that came out a couple years ago that was put out by the Institute for Policy Studies and the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative at Prosperity Now was that it would take an average of 228 years for the average Black family to catch up to the wealth of a white family today.
And that's if we remove the conditions that currently create inequality. Unfortunately, these things are getting worse instead of getting better. And it's posited by, 2053?
2053.
2053, the average wealth of a Black family in America will be zero.
Yeah.
Wait, okay. Hold up. Because you guys just said like 5 things that are a problem for me. So first, it's 2020 right now. And you're saying that this divide is getting greater, not smaller? How is that even a thing? How could that possibly, like, what we see and what we hear is like, oh, we're getting more educated and we're getting more resources and slavery is so long ago. Like, how could that be happening?
Slavery didn't really end. It changed forms. I mean, it's even in the Constitution. That's the whole thing. The 13 documentary. I wrote a song about it, about how the whole thing is like they say slavery shouldn't exist, except if you get locked up.
Yeah. The prison industrial complex has also been a big contributor to the racial wealth divide. I believe there's a stat out there that 1 out of every 3 Black Americans has a family member in jail, in prison.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's something like 1 out of 3 Black males ended up in jail.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In their lifetime.
Yeah. And the thing is, the reason why it's getting bigger is, 1, this has been happening over generations, right? 228 years is just about how long ago slavery was. So generational poverty compounds on itself just like generational wealth does.
Yeah, and one thing about generational poverty and generational wealth, a lot of people like to talk about these things as if they are mindsets.
Yeah.
As if they are attitudes. And mindsets or attitudes, i.e., meaning something that we can do something about, something that we have the ability to change, when in fact they are conditions, things that they are born into, also things that are compounded.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think too, the thing about personal finance and the thing about talking about finances is there's a lot of rhetoric around personal responsibility and this idea that you put yourself in the position that you found yourself in. So you should be able to get yourself out. And if you didn't get yourself out, then it's your fault. And to place that concept on an entire race or races of people is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense when you really think about it. That's like saying like every single Asian person is bad at driving, you know?
Right. Those stereotypes that not only remind us of a fake status quo, but enforce it because people place that expectation on you. The thing that I was saying about how this is compounded, I think is particularly important in that when we talk about wealth is a measurement more of time.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think of wealth as the amount of time it would take you if you stop making money now to run out of what you got.
Yeah. And that's where generational wealth comes in, where you can pass on your wealth to future generations and they also don't run out of money. And the thing about the racial wealth divide is the reason why we made it about race, first of all, is because white people made it about race. They created these policies that specifically marginalize people. And then they
created the white people thing.
Yeah, they created the white people thing. Oh my God. I have to tell you about
Because Europe is mad big.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like Europe, and like I've been to Europe, and I don't think that they think that they're all the same people.
I don't think so either. But when they come, everyone's white, and I'm just Asian, right? But one thing, in terms of what Dyalekt was saying, that has a historical event tied to it too. Bacon's Rebellion, which you may be familiar with learning in high school vaguely, right, was a rebellion where white indentured servants and black slaves,
I believe mostly the Irish.
Yes, mostly the Irish, kind of looked at each other and they're like, hey, wait a minute.
This is whack.
Yeah, we don't have to take this. Mm-hmm. And so they rebelled against their masters.
The intro track to It Was Written by Nas.
Yes, there you go. The rebellion was not successful, but the slave masters got scared. And they're like, well, we can't have that happen again. So what can we do? And what they did was they basically decided, all right, when our white indentured servants finish their servitude, we're going to make them full-fledged citizens. They're going to have all the rights we have.
They even said that they were going to stop trying to chase them down if they run free.
Yeah, they're just going to, because you couldn't tell the difference between them and the slave masters.
It was too hard.
Yeah, but the African slaves were going to be permanently slaves, as were their kids, on and on and on.
Because they were color-coded.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is where the concept of whiteness and blackness was born. It was purely an economic decision in the United States. It was purely created by the elite and the aristocracy to say, hey, white people, you get to be white, and that means something. And black people, you get to be black, and that means something too.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that the concept of race and racism itself isn't initially an emotional decision.
Yeah.
It's a cold-hearted, calculating business decision interested in dividing people.
Yeah, and they turned it into an emotional decision by essentially pitting people against each other instead of questioning the system that was keeping them where they were.
Well,
and that's where we are today.
Well, and through the greatest thing of all, metaphor. Art has been created throughout the years, from your minstrel shows to your stereotypical TV films that you have going on, to the types of music, gangster rap being proliferated, all of that. Art and culture has perpetuated these ideas that give the emotional depth to the calculating mathematics of racism.
I mean, even just to give you an example, a recent one is, you know the term welfare queen, right?
Yes.
So tell me what image conjures up in your head when you hear the term welfare queen.
Kia Stevens from the show Glow on Netflix. She plays a character called Welfare Queen.
You, Lauren.
Oh, Lauren, yeah.
I'm like, I don't know who that girl is on Netflix, but there's some babies on the hips. There's some rollers in the hair. Like, we in the projects.
And the welfare queen's black, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. So the actual welfare queen was actually a white woman who pretended to be 47 different people, including black women. And Ronald Reagan basically turned the welfare queen into an analog for, hey, black people are just lazy and don't work and they're trying to live off the dole. So let's not have welfare. Even though the people who benefit from welfare the most are white people. That's the kind of art and culture that pervades our society so much that I just say the phrase and you already have an image in your head. And you already know what race they are. You already know what demographic they're in. You know where they live, all of that stuff.
So tell me a little bit more about how media is playing a part in this, because I'm a young black female raised in an area where there wasn't a lot going on. And, you might call it the hood, et cetera. I didn't live in the projects per se, but I've clearly been affected by what I've seen or heard because that came to my mind. And I'm sure I'm not the only Black person who had that come to mind. And this is my people that I'm talking about. So how is media and art and culture playing a role in affecting people of color, I'll say?
One thing that I think that's important to talk about, it's a demotivator. It's something out there that tells you that you can't do it. We all face imposter syndrome, no matter your race, your background, if you're born rich or born poor. You have imposter syndrome, you have these feelings, these doubts, these fears. And when these fears are compounded by images out there telling you, yeah, actually, no, you can't do it. You aren't born to do it. I've got reasoning. I've got some fake science behind why you can't do it. Well, there's another reason for you not to be able to make it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting combination of the fact that we're told that art isn't important. It's defunded in our schools. Those programs don't exist. At the same time that you see how important art is, because what you see on TV, what you see on the news, what you hear on the radio perpetuates all of these stereotypes.
Art is important. There isn't a religion you ever heard of that doesn't use songs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go. So media is, I think, a big contributor to us allowing these policies to exist. And I will say, too, I mean, the social media culture right now and Instagram culture, how many memes, how many Instagram posts do you see where people are like, well, you know, if you just stop buying those Nike shoes, if you just stop buying that big screen TV, if you just stop buying those expensive clothes, then you'd have wealth, right?
Right. If you buy a Nike stock instead of a pair of shoes, that's the one I see all the time.
Oh, man. I was at a conference where a respected cat whose name I'm not going to drop to be polite said something like that, and I about lost my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, that means nothing.
Buy those shoes if you want, y'all. Just if you're listening, don't buy that one stock.
Exactly. Well, what those kinds of things do is they create a narrative where they tell people you shouldn't have empathy for poor people. You should blame them for the reason they're in that situation instead of wondering what the system has done to put them there.
I was thinking in particular about, what was that? A couple of years ago, there was that story about the gentleman who had 4 kids and he was doing everything he can. It was like a little slice of life for a regular Joe. And it was this single father, had 4 kids, and he was working hard to take care of them all. And there was this narrative, this huge thing about, well, what was he doing having kids?
Yeah. Yeah, that was what the comment said. Why did he have 4 kids? Jeez, what an asshole.
And when we talk about the idea of personal responsibility, and we all do have some responsibility in our life, but responsibility is our ability to respond to things, if you break down the language.
Mm-hmm.
Things happen in life. We have plans, we have ideas, we make mistakes, things go awry. That's right. Things go awry and we make do and make life better. And when we are presented with these types of things and the narrative becomes making do, making life better is a mistake, that gives us less reason to try and more reason to just accept what we're given. And to bring things back around to the racial wealth divide isn't just how stereotypes and trust and fear of other ethnicities have led to wealth inequality, because there is a part of that. It's a great deal about how this art and this culture has allowed us to not pay attention to the policies that actually make it hard and oftentimes impossible for folks to achieve a higher station.
Okay, let's pause there and talk about some of the policies, because I think we're sometimes unaware of what systems are in place that are prohibiting us from moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. This is why we bring up history in general. I think it's worthwhile to dive deep into some of the key policies historically that have led to generational poverty. The first one we mentioned was Jim Crow. Jim Crow, separate but not equal, but we all know what that means, right? Those policies basically already made Black people be second-class citizens, essentially, and to not have access to the services that white citizens have access to.
To try to make it quick and simple, which it's not, segregation was a huge problem, and then desegregation was an even bigger problem. Segregation limited Black people's access to the rest of the country, to resources, to community, to land, to lots of other things. And like I was saying earlier, people make do, they figure it out. And then guess what happened? Desegregation happened. And after desegregation happened, all of these Black-owned businesses, grocery stores, these law firms, who had clients and customers, well, now their customers were free to take anyone. So some of them left and worked with white businesses, which would make sense because that's what desegregation is about.
Right.
But white customers did not go to these black businesses. When schools were desegregated, so many black teachers lost their jobs because parents complained that they would not allow their white children to go to a class. If they had to go to a class with black kids, that's one thing, but they certainly weren't going to go to a class with a black teacher.
So we started to diversify our dollars outside of our community, but white people kept their dollars in their community, and there kept some segregation despite there being quote unquote desegregation.
Exactly.
White people, you didn't hug us back financially.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because one of the things I was going to ask you guys about a little bit later was this idea that all these cultures are doing better. I hear frequently that the Jewish people are doing better, or the Cubans in Miami, example. There's tons of others, but that there's a problem within the Black community with us supporting one another. And that's what's holding us back from moving forward. Can you guys share a little bit about that?
Interesting that you mentioned Jewish people and Cuban people. I would add Asian people to the mix. And I think another part of the culture of the racial wealth divide includes this concept of having a path to whiteness, right? Irish people were also considered Black back in the day.
Or at least not white.
At least not white, yeah. And so the other way that the racial wealth divide has been allowed to perpetuate is to allow races at certain points in time to move up and to be considered white. This idea of a path to whiteness, this idea of, okay, now I have the same privileges as a white person, to the point where I don't think of an Irish person as anything but white. I don't think of a Jewish person as anything but white at this point. And to the point where...
I know certain awful people beg to differ, but, that's why they're awful.
Yes, exactly. But this idea and this concept of path to whiteness has also allowed the racial wealth divide to happen, because really, when you start to separate people in that way, then you give people that feeling of, oh, now I'm superior. Now I have access to these privileges that I didn't have access to before, and I want to keep those privileges. I
want to take it in another direction, too. You're familiar with the Tulsa Black Wall Street massacre, where Black-owned businesses were firebombed by enraged white people. I spoke to someone who was about my age, who grew up in Tulsa, lived there their whole life, lives there now. And they told me that when they were kids, that white people would warn them not to act up, or they would firebomb them back to oblivion again. So when you ask why we don't support each other, we have been very much incentivized not to. There's not only the individualism that you see in your Instagram type of star culture, there's also plain cold threats that folks get, sometimes as direct as the stuff you hear in Tulsa, sometimes through ideas of people being thugs or not that type of person, or we don't do that here. They may have some hushed tones that they put it in, but people are definitely told in no uncertain terms, if you stay with Black people, it will lead to nothing but ruin.
To go back to the policies too, after desegregation, there were other policies that were put in place. One of them is there was an unofficial, I don't even think we can call it a policy, but the GI Bill basically meant that if you served in the military, you would have access to housing and access to college education. What ended up happening, though, was the African Americans who served in the military in World War II.
And tons of Black folks have served in every single war.
Yeah, but they were encouraged to go to vocational schools instead of colleges, and were steered in that direction. And when it came to housing, even though they technically had access to veterans loans, VA loans, they were denied most of the time. To give you an example, there was one summer in Mississippi, I believe in the 1950s, where they issued 3,000 VA loans, and 3 of them were given to Black veterans.
Wow.
So the GI Bill, even though it was technically supposed to be this great equalizer, was used as another way to basically not allow Black people to be able to build generational wealth.
And when we talk about generational wealth and all this, I know we say a racial wealth divide, and race means a lot of things, and there are a number of races, and we're talking a lot specifically about Black Americans, because in this country, the way that both race and wealth have been built have been on this paradigm of being Black, being white, or being on your way to either. Yep. And while there are other races and they are discriminated against in other ways similarly, those ways germinate from the Black-white paradigm.
Yeah. I mean, just to give you an example of that, Chinese people were considered black in the 1910s when they were building the railroads.
Mm-hmm.
And when the Japanese were the enemies in World War II, Chinese people started to be considered white and Japanese people started to be considered black. And it was just circumstance. It was just, hey, this is who we need to be black and this is who we need to be white right now.
Those buttons
Yeah.
that they wore that said not Japanese.
Yep. Another policy that was put into place by the Federal Housing Administration, actually, surprisingly, when we learned this, you may have heard of redlining. Redlining is literally the concept of mortgage lenders would draw red lines around neighborhoods and say that they would only lend to white people within the red lines. And so the Federal Housing Administration actually instituted this when they started subsidizing housing. So, this idea that everyone should be able to afford a home, and they started giving out mortgages and started backing mortgages. They actually put a policy in place that said they would not fund subsidized developments if homes were given to Black Americans. So redlining was something that started with the government and continues to this day.
So much threats too, man. So many threats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read a story about, I think it was Cory Booker's father who was trying to purchase a home during this time and was not able to purchase a home and actually ended up giving his funds to a white man to purchase the home and hiring a lawyer to go through this process. And once they found out that it was actually his father that was trying to purchase the home, there was a big to-do and a lot of back and forth, screaming and yelling, et cetera. But he actually did win. And that was one of the things that kind of changed the trajectory for his family, was being able to purchase that home in that community.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, having to go and jump through those hoops just to be able to own your home, that's insane, right?
Unbelievable.
Still happens today. There's a new thing called digital redlining, which is as sinister as it sounds.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why it's sinister is because everyone's wiping their hands of it. The ProPublica actually did this investigation with Facebook, and Facebook has these things called affinity groups. The way affinity group works is you're not allowed to call out a race or separate people by race.
Because that kind of stuff is illegal.
Yes, exactly. Discrimination not allowed, right? So they have these affinity groups, and the way they work, Dyalekt, if you want to explain.
Yeah, they can't say you're Black, right? But if you tapped on Boyz II Men reunion tour and R.I.P. Kobe Bryant and possibly collard greens on sale, then they'll put you into a Black affinity. You like Black stuff. What's awful about it is it seems more racist to me than just putting us in our categories based on our actual ethnicity. Twitter has a similar one, and I don't know if you've looked yours up, but I'm listed demographically on Twitter as a single Black mother.
That is so interesting. It also explains too, on Netflix, the only thing I can get is Tyler Perry movies now. And it's I watch one and I know there's other stuff out there. Why do they only show me these shows? But this is it. This is what they're categorizing. They're saying this is what I am. And that's all I want to watch.
Like
Exactly.
people watch Adam Sandler too. Come on.
Yeah.
Right.
With these affinity groups, what they were doing was, because you could create Facebook ads based on these categories, mortgage lenders and realtors were actually excluding Black and brown affinity groups from their ads. And so they were essentially redlining people by not showing them mortgage rates, by not showing them homes that were for sale, by literally leaving them out of the
I'll let that settle for a second, because that was a lot, right?
That was a lot. The fact that, like you said, it's 2020 and we still have instances of this happening, and it's clear as day. I know one of the things that happened to me recently was I got a check in the mail from Wells Fargo, or nope, it was Chase actually, for my mortgage. So I purchased a home in 2006, and as part of a class action lawsuit, it was decided that being a person of color, I did not receive the kind of mortgage that I should have. I mean, their quote unquote restitution was, a very small check in comparison to the amount that I paid extra on that house, what mortgage rates were. Now that I'm a financial planner, was able to look into that a little bit more. But like you said, we have very recent, relevant instances of things that are happening that are still holding us back.
Yeah, I remember someone trying to pejoratively talk about Black tax, meaning something about us not supporting each other. But the Black tax is the actual literal extra money that you have to pay for the same good or service if you're Black that other folks don't have to pay.
Wow. Just not right. All right. So I feel like we've done a really good job of making it clear for the person that's just like, work harder, be more financially responsible. I don't understand what this is all about. Like, we broke it down for y'all. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about how do we reverse things that are happening right now, and how do we start making the rules that are in place work for us so that we can make some sort of change?
Just what we want to talk about. You know, the thing about the history that's great is when we learn the history, I know it's a lot of it is sad. These are bad things that happened. But it's great for us to understand this history because once we understand the history, we see how this was built.
Yes.
You can see the path. You see the policies that actually worked out, and you see the ways in which some were discriminatory.
Yeah, and I think too, when you understand the history of how this happened, it allows you to question what's happening now. I think that when you have an awareness of what to look for because of what's happened in the past and you see the results of it, now you can start to question it. And what that practically looks like from a personal finance standpoint is to understand the system enough to be able to take advantage of it. One of the things that we have started talking about recently with personal finance is to think of personal finance as an act of social justice. And for you to be able to handle your finances, to put on your oxygen mask first, to file your taxes on time, to have a good credit score, to have an estate plan, all of those things that build a foundation for you financially are also you now having the ability to access things that your family may have not been able to access before.
And we don't mean this as a metaphor. There was something that the Black Panthers used to say to folks that you need to have your stuff together so that the police can't run up on you and take you off the street. And financially, we need to be in the same position. We need to be able to stay in the game and take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others. Because we can't do any kind of revolutionary or even simple act without being able to pay our bills.
Where do you get access to this information, though? So we're talking about taking responsibility and becoming financial literate is what I hear you guys saying. But we also know that the financial industry is 2.2% people of color and 23% women. So it doesn't have a lot of diversity in it. So how do you get access to advice that is appropriate for you or not ending up in the hands of someone that is mostly economically privileged?
That's the hardest part of it all, right? The system and the rules within the system are pretty convoluted. And we actually don't like to use the term financial literacy. We prefer to use the term financial resilience.
Well, we think of financial literacy as a first step.
Yes.
It's a step and it's a real step and it's one we need to understand. But all the literacy in the world doesn't help when that check doesn't come.
Right. And in terms of what you're saying, Lauren, about how do you know who to turn to and how do you know where to get your advice from, that's where the resilience really comes in, is understanding that you might have to learn some of the stuff the hard way. You may have already learned some of the stuff the hard way. And I just want to tell you now, that doesn't mean you're bad at it. That doesn't mean you're not financially literate. That doesn't mean you're wrong. That doesn't mean you're bad at money. It just means the system was set up for you to fail.
That's another important reason why we should understand where all this all came from. So that we know that we're not crazy. So we know that we're not wrong, that we're not stupid. And that's what gives us the resilience to keep doing stuff. Because if you're listening right now and this feels all super daunting, remember that despite all of this stuff happening, you're here.
Yeah.
And you may not be where you want to be, but you're not where you could be.
I wish I could say that there was a magical certification or a designation that you could look for to know whether or not you could trust someone. But Lauren, those stats that you just gave us were real. 2.2%. What was it? 2.2% of certified financial.
I think it's 2.2% are African Americans. I think it's 3.5 total people of color. 3.5%.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we lump everybody into that 3.5. We're the majority among the minority, I guess, as people of color.
Yeah. Part of it is before you start looking for advice, I think it's important for you to think about what your values are. There's 250,000 financial advisors in the country. You're going to find someone who works for you. And you tend to attract people who you're looking for if you know what you're looking for. That's what I found is when you figure out what your values are and you figure out the type of person who you're looking for to help you achieve those values, then you'll find them. And
one of the fortunate things about that is the best way to figure out what your values are financially is to do the same stuff that you need to do anyway if you're going to make sure that you take care of your finances practically.
Yeah.
You need to look at the things you've been spending money on. The things that you spend money on are the things that you value. And if they're not things that you value, those are things that you probably should cut out of your budget.
I like it. I like it. So, I mean, the other part of it is like, this thing is not just black and white. It affects people of color, but we need to all be a part of the conversation. And so there may be people that are listening out there and they kind of fall on one side or the other as it pertains to what we're saying. We stirred the pot a little bit here. Some people are saying like, oh, yes, amen, hallelujah, speak. And then other people are just like, no, I'm not buying into it. So in thinking about how to have a mindset shift and how to change the way that we move and get intentional about this, if you're a person that hasn't been convinced one side or the other, how do you just like join the conversation? How can we encourage people, black, white, blue, green, purple, whoever's listening right now, to join the conversation, period?
I want to share a stat.
Because that's what always brings people together is statistics.
But here's the thing. The world's 26 richest people own as much as the poorest 50%. Right? That's an Oxfam stat.
Of the world.
In The Guardian of the world. The world's 26 richest people.
That's like 4 billion people have as much as 26 people.
Yes.
I can't even fathom that kind of numbers.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's think about who really benefits from wealth inequality, because the racial wealth divide is a subsection of the wealth divide that is happening in this country, and that affects everyone. And the thing is, what they've done, these people in the top 1% or top 0.0000001% have taught us to do is to fight with each other for crumbs instead of asking for a bigger piece of the pie. And that's what's going on right now, is the racial wealth divide is a symptom of wealthy elite basically perpetuating a system where all of the money only funnels up and certainly has not been trickling down.
Yeah, just because you may find yourself in one of those more favored non-white ethnicities, or if you are white, this system may tangentially benefit you, but it's not necessarily there to benefit you.
It's not for you.
And doesn't care about you.
Yeah.
Ooh, I love this. I love this. I love this. Like you said, this is not a black-white issue per se. This is not about I believe in what you're saying or I don't believe in what you're saying. This affects all of us, and it negatively affects all of us, is what you're saying.
All of us. White supremacy doesn't care about white people either.
That's the real of it. This is just a system. I saw this comedian the other day who was from Africa, and he said, one thing I noticed about America and Americans is that Americans aren't racist. America is racist. We are carrying out the orders of our country. I thought that was a really interesting perspective on it.
Wow. So we talked a little bit about like from the person of color, what they can do to take on some responsibility and to start changing the game for themselves. What can white people do specifically to join the conversation? What can they be intentional about in order to take on some responsibility for this thing and closing this gap?
When it comes to, because this is a delicate subject, right? I don't know when the word privilege suddenly became a dirty word, but privilege used to mean like, oh, something good. You have something good, right? And I think that one thing that I like to ask my white friends to do, and I do myself because I have my own set of privileges, is to question our privileges and to recognize them and acknowledge them. I think that when it comes to being a part of the conversation, one of the things that I like to say is maybe your part of the conversation is listening, and maybe your part of the conversation is acknowledging that what the other person's experiences is true. Just because it didn't happen to you or hasn't happened to you doesn't mean that it hasn't happened to somebody else. And I think that if we start there and we start by believing each other, instead of being like, well, that never happened to me or anybody I know, so that couldn't have happened to you, which I think is the gut reaction. We get defensive because we don't want to believe that that's actually how it works, is to really listen and to acknowledge and to believe what people are telling you.
One thing that a lot of people misconstrue, we have this idea, and this is not something that I came up with, but I'm forgetting who I got this quote from, but we have this idea that freedom, overall freedom, equality means that we have a lot to gain. And if we can shift our thinking to equality means we have to be okay with giving up things. And we start thinking about the things that we are okay with letting go of so that we can create equality. One thing that I want from folks who have privileges in any ways and all ways that y'all got them going on is to not be an ally, be an accomplice.
Ooh. Come on, tell us more. Tell us more.
Well, I have a very current event about this.
Ooh, what's your current event?
Yeah, affirmative action. Let's talk about that, everybody. I feel like people only like affirmative action until it stops benefiting them. The people who are the biggest benefactors of affirmative action are white women and Asian people, right? When it came to colleges letting demographics in that historically were not represented at their colleges, more white women ended up being able to get into college, and more Asian people ended up being able to get into college. A Chinese parent recently sued Harvard University for denying their child admission into the university and blaming affirmative action on it. What's interesting about that is he didn't blame legacy admissions in, right? He didn't blame the white families who had been allowed to have their children go to Harvard for generations and generations and generations. He blamed the affirmative action that actually put him in the position to be able to have his child apply to Harvard. One thing that I think about when it comes to what I am willing to give up, and it's really weird and visceral and difficult for me to say this as I'm looking at my child right now, but it's okay if my child doesn't get into the best possible college ever because someone else did instead. And someone else whose family generationally didn't have the opportunity to, but I had the opportunity to be able to put my son in a position where he could get into college and have the resources to give him that opportunity. And those are the kinds of things I think about in terms of it's not only what you can gain, but what you do have to give up and sacrifice a little bit on the other end when you do find yourself in a place of privilege.
When I say give up, it's more of a let go of than a sacrifice.
Yes, yeah.
Because sacrifice, one of the big things about wealth, and you can often see it with race and wealth, is the difference between sacrifice and risk. When Mark Zuckerberg decided to drop out of college and start his whole business, that was a risk. But it wasn't a sacrifice. I even heard recently that he was offered he could either go to college or start a McDonald's franchise. That was the deal his parents gave him. And it cost $500,000 to start a McDonald's franchise. So I guess either way, he was going to be okay. Maybe he would have started Facebook from behind the fries. That would have been a thing.
Because McDonald's is still very alive and well. That's for sure.
It wasn't a bad shot either way. But the thing is, even if both of those things had bottomed out and worst case scenario, he would have been fine. He was taking a risk, but it wasn't like a life or death risk. It was a risk that he could recover from. In many families of color, because of this lack of generational wealth, we don't have that. If you get to college, it's because of a lot of sacrifice of others, of family members. You know, when they talk about taking a village, it does take a whole community sometimes. That's why you'll see communities taking such pride in their like sports stars or business big people because they literally built them.
So one thing that I think is important to bring up is these are listeners. No one can see you guys' face right now. We have these unconscious biases. We have these perceptions and things that build what we think or see. And when you're getting something audibly, you're having these pictures in your head. So can you guys tell us a little bit about your background and what people might not know about Pam and Dyalekt? Who's giving us all this information on the race or wealth divide right now?
I'm just some guy who married well.
You're more than that.
Yeah, no, I'm stuck. I am mixed race. My mother is Black and my father was a white Jewish immigrant from Russia. So I'm a mixed race. I go by Black. I'm light skinned. I definitely have light skin privilege. That's one of those fun things, you know, when we talk about stuff like light skin and white privilege. And I'm like, I can relate. I remember times when I was like, I don't get light skin privilege. I still get harassed and like cops be following me and stuff like that. But I'm, of course, not noticing the stuff that I'm not noticing. And being able to share that, I think, makes us more able to share back. Professionally, I am a musician and theater maker and educator. I say all those all at the same time because I mostly do them all at once. I have a tendency to make one-person plays that are rap albums as well as curriculum. I am the director of pedagogy at Pockets Change, a hip-hop and finance organization where we work with kids as young as 6 years old and as old as college ready and talk to them about not only the practical stuff, but the emotional ways that they deal with their finances. I'm also a podcast host with a bunch of podcasts. with Pam Capalad of the Preach to the Choir podcast, also parts of the Race and Wealth podcast network with Deidre Asante Muhammad. It's a whole lot of things that we be doing.
Yes, I'm like reminding you of your own bio.
All the things.
I just put out a new record, The Museum of Dead Words. It's available for streaming all the places.
Yes, that record is based on him spending a year researching internet comments to find out what words turn conversations into fights.
Well, to talk about that real quick, one of the things about the insidiousness of the racial wealth divide is that folks have been slick with language to be able to make it okay for people to do these types of things to each other. Even the phrase personal responsibility, which sounds so benign, but is entrenched in the idea that people are lacking in responsibility. That's the tone, even when it's written. It's really impressive the way that they've done it to folks. Personal responsibility becomes this albatross hanging on your back, making it feel like, well, I guess I am wrong because I am stupid and I am inferior, which just perpetuates the whole thing.
Yeah.
And beating that back is Pam, and this is her background.
Yes. So I am Filipino and Chinese American. I am actually not even first generation. I am an immigrant. I actually moved here when I was 2 years old from the Philippines, or I guess my grandparents brought me here. And I grew up in the Bay Area, and I actually have a literature degree. But I got into finance because I was teaching financial literacy camps for kids when I was in college. And I was like, oh my God, why didn't we get this in school? And I had a light bulb go off in my head that I wanted to explore the financial services industry. I right now currently own my own business called Brunch and Budget. And the reason why I became passionate about the racial wealth divide is because about half of my clients are people of color. And I found that I was planning for them differently than my white clients. Often my clients who are people of color were first generation college students, first generation immigrants, and first generation to have a professional salary, sometimes all three. And they were dealing with financial situations that I hadn't seen before, honestly, in wealth management, that I hadn't seen with my white clients. They're more likely to have student loan debt. They're less likely to have home ownership in their family. They're more likely to be sending money home. They're more likely to be helping take care of other families' expenses. They were less likely to have an inheritance or a safety cushion. They were less likely to be able to move back home. All of these safety nets and all of these cushions that they didn't have access to meant that they were the first generation to start to have to build those safety nets. And so what I found was I could have two clients both making $100,000 a year, and one client was able to save really easily, and another client was sending money to her brother regularly, was paying for a parent's cell phone bill, was calling them and their mortgage lender to make sure that they kept their house. So all of these things that went into working with clients of color had me wondering, there has to be something to this. There has to be something behind this that I don't really understand or know yet. And that's when I really started investigating the racial wealth divide.
And it sounds like you need a very specific skill set, or what they teach us in CFP school, if you will, doesn't cover the topics that you just talked about. It doesn't cover the different aspects of cultures as it pertains to financial planning. So you had to go do more research to figure out how to be a better planner to your clients.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I feel like that we talk a lot about inclusion, and we talk a lot about financial planning is for everyone and this idealistic vision of it. And the only way to make that a reality is to get specific. When you say financial planning is for everyone, that means that you have to understand what everyone really encompasses. When you're like, financial planning is for everyone, so I'm going to do the same thing for everyone, that means that your financial planning practice is for no one. And so when you start to get specific and you start to say, oh, this is what I know about my women clients, this is what I know about my freelancer clients, this is what I know about my Black clients, this is what I know about my Asian clients, then you're able to really make financial planning inclusive. And I think that's what's super important about understanding things like the racial wealth divide as a financial planner.
And it's not racist per se to be separating these folks into things. It's knowing the things that are their needs. It's a similar issue that folks find with Black hair. Black hair is often different from other different people's hair and needs to be treated a specific way. It's not racist to do it differently when it makes it come out right.
Amen, amen, amen. You guys have dropped so many bombs, nuggets, gems, all the knowledge on us today. I thank you so much for being on the show. If you did not get enough, if this just scratched the surface for you and you're itching for more as it pertains to knowing about the racial wealth divide, I highly, 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 highly encourage you to run on over to the Brunch and Budget podcast. They have tons of information And I'll, of course, post where you can find Pam and Dyalekt in the show notes. Anything else you guys want to share before we go?
We alluded to it a little bit before, but reminding folks, we really love saying this because it's important. Where you spend your money is a representation of what you value. Look at where you're spending your money. It will help you remember your values and where you're putting your money so you can make the right decisions with it.
Hallelujah. Amen. Pam and Dyalekt, thanks so much for being on the show.
For having us.
I hope you all enjoyed listening to Pam and Dyalekt discuss their perspective on the racial wealth divide. You could definitely hear their passion as they share their own experiences and discuss where the problems are coming from. Our word of the day today, black tax. This is something that many people don't believe actually exists, and it has multiple interpretations. Some refer to it as the income Black professionals give to their families to support them. Others say that it's a series of things such as biased hiring practices, pay disparity, unequal promotion, unfair housing, and the list goes on. Pam and Dyalekt shared a lot of information on the policies that are continuing to allow the racial wealth divide to exist. I urge you to use this as an opportunity to continue educating yourself on the topic. Look into the things they shared with us on your own. Then look for ways to act and make a difference based on what you learned. Thanks for tuning in today. We hope you found this episode worth listening to. As always, if you have financial questions, suggestions for guests, or would like to share your own money memoir, please contact us through the website worth-listening.com.